Hey everybody, happy Thursday. I'm sorry that the video from yesterday wasn't working. I guess it was just too long. Chapter 8 was a long one. So I'm going to reread that today. I'm going to split the video up into two sections so that you can listen to it for yesterday's work and today's work. I hope everything's going well at home. So, Chapter 8. Alfie was well acquainted with the baggage hold and the many hours he had spent there searching for the source of the Jack the Ripper scrapbook. He had learned the locations of most of his passengers' luggage. It was the work of but a few moments to find the Bronson trunk and open it with the shiny metal key Mrs. Bronson had provided. He lifted the lid. There was surprisingly little clothing for two first-class ladies. Instead, the majority of the space was taken up with large bundles of printed pamphlets, brochures, and posters, blazoning the slogans of the suffrage cause. "Votes for women now," declared one. Another proclaimed, "Second-class citizens no longer." There were also handbills advertising rallies all across England featuring Amelia Bronson. No wonder Sophie's mother had crossed the ocean just to make a few speeches. She was her movement's shining beacon. He removed an armload of literature and locked the trunk again. That was Alfie's errand in the hold, to fetch a selection for Mrs. Bronson. Before returning to the upper decks, he slipped under the netting that secured the Astor's luggage. "Patty, are you awake?" he whispered. "I've brought you some bread." He eased open the lid of the linen trunk and peered inside. The outline of Patty's compact frame was evident in the fine fabric. The stowaway himself was nowhere in sight. It was not a great shock. No one could be expected to spend days on end lying in a steamer trunk. But it was worrisome just the same. For were to be caught, Mr. Lightoll's first question would likely be, "Who has been helping you?" Alfie found Mrs. Bronson on the enclosed promenade on B deck, 70 vertical feet above her luggage. There she stood, resplendent in purple, white, and green, in the company of her daughter and Juliana. "The pamphlets you wanted, ma'am," he panted, out of breath from the climb. "Thank you, Alfie. I'm sure the Major will find these very enlightening." "The Major?" Sophie was amazed. "These are for Major Muttonchop?" Her mother nodded. "He specifically asked for them." You're fooling yourself. His interest in suffrage is nothing more than a ploy to ensnare you to listen to his war stories, his hunting stories, his school stories, and everything else that's happened to him since he graduated from the cradle." "I'd like to read one," Juliana ventured timidly. Mrs. Bronson beamed at the prospect of a new recruit. "May you never know the humiliation that your mother and grandmother continue to endure," she said, handing over a selection of leaflets. "If I were you," Sophie offered, "I wouldn't show those to your father. His lordship doesn't strike me as the suffrage type." "In that case, definitely show them to your father," her mother countered. "You cannot expect real change unless you're willing to shake things up a bit." Sophie sniffed. "Is that why you spend so many of your nights in prison cells?" The suffragist was untroubled. "A prison cell is far more agreeable to me than the ridiculous, unnecessary comforts of this ship, if it means I'm getting attention for the cause." "The one in London had rats," her daughter reminded her with a shudder. "There are worse things than rats, Sophie. Pig-headed men who are keeping half the population as second-class citizens comes to mind." "Excuse me." Junior Steward Trihorn approached the group and took Alfie aside. "He wants you," he said in a low voice. Alfie smiled apologetically at the three ladies and turned his attention to the newcomer. "He? Who?" "Masterson. He asked for you by name." Alfie's heart sank into his boots. This was it, then. If Mr. Masterson had sent for him, the purpose was surely to denounce him to one of the officers. His future as a White Star Line employee and Dawes crewmate was over. So if we remember back to the last it was 2 chapters ago when it was from Alfie's perspective, when he was helping Mr. Masterson, trying to kind of get to know him more so that they can learn more about him possibly being Jack the Ripper. Mr. Masterson was so rude that Alfie kind of stood up for himself and spoke back. And servants at this point were definitely not supposed to do that type of thing, particularly to a first-class passenger or a wealthy passenger. "Where is he?" Alfie asked finally. "Was there anyone with him? Mr. Lightoller, perhaps?" "He's in his stateroom," Trihorn replied. "He rang for a steward, and when I arrived, he was his usual charming self. He threw me out and demanded you, the old rotter." You're the lucky one, Alfie groaned. I have to deal with the man. The irony of it was enough to make him weep. He was about to be condemned and ruined by Jack the Ripper. He sighed. All right, I'll go. But if you don't hear from me, send out a search party. He faced Mrs. Bronson, her daughter, and Juliana once more. If you'll excuse me, ladies, Mr. Masterson requires my attention. Take along a chair and a whip, Mrs. Bronson advised darkly. That's a nasty piece of work if I ever met one. Sophie was shocked. Mother, what an unkind thing to say. It's not unkind if it's the truth. I see the way that man looks at me, at all women. He hates us. I admit that he's not the nicest person aboard, Sophie conceded, but it can't be easy to be him. He's probably in pain every time he tries to walk. I understand suffering, Amelia Bronson replied. Woman hatred is a separate matter. It is the product of a sick mind. Don't turn your back on him, Alfie dear. As he trudged up the companion stairs to A deck, Alfie wondered how seriously he should take Mrs. Bronson's warning. She certainly had an instinct for the evil that emanated from Mr. Masterson. After all, Jack the Ripper was the most notorious woman-hater of all time. And now he has every reason to be angry with me, Alfie thought. Of course, the man was old and crippled now, but his upper body strength was nothing short of miraculous. Alfie would do well to stay alert behind the closed door of stateroom A17. That door appeared before him, and he knocked lightly. Enter, said a gruff voice. What took you so long? You had a more pressing engagement? Alfie stepped inside, making sure to leave the stateroom door open. How may I help you, sir? Masterson sat in an overstuffed armchair, his crutch close at hand. He looked up defiantly. I require your assistance to get on with my day. The wave of relief nearly knocked Alfie flat. For some reason, this disagreeable old beast did not intend to turn him in for his rudeness earlier on. There was only one thing that didn't make sense. Steward Trihorn is assigned to you, sir. He is more than capable of seeing to your needs. That ninnyhammer? The old man scoffed. He can barely see to his own needs. I want you. Alfie swallowed hard. I had the impression that you found my service unsatisfactory. You're not paid to form impressions, Masterson growled. Still, you're the only person on this gilded barge with any backbone. I like that. Alfie shut his eyes for a brief, dizzy moment. To be liked by Jack the Ripper? Oh, what would Mum say? Thank you, sir. I'm happy to be able to be of assistance. The old man laughed. No, you're not. You'd like to take my crutch and beat me over the head with it. Admit it. You think I don't know I'm a cantankerous old louse? I mean, it's a cranky old man. You try dragging yourself around on two gammy legs and see how sunny your disposition is. Alfie began tidying the nightstand, straightening pill bottles, and laying out fresh handkerchiefs. It helped not to be looking at Masterson directly. It was hard to carry on a conversation while gazing into those hooded cobra eyes. Might I ask you, sir, Alfie ventured, how long you've had this regrettable condition? Have you always been thus? No, not always. More's the pity. Many years ago, I was a strapping young lad going about my business. I don't even remember what spooked that horse. Some say lightning. The passengers in the carriage were both killed. They were the lucky ones. I was crushed under the wheels. Spinal damage. You were the lucky one, Alfie said seriously. You have your life. You call this a life, boy? Masterson spat. 24 years ago, I was doing important work, accomplishing something. Without it, I'm less than a man. Important work? The words chilled Alfie to his core. Could Jack the Ripper have looked upon his killing spree as a mission? If it hadn't been for that carriage accident, the grisly Whitechapel murders might have continued. So Alfie is kind of thinking that maybe why the murder stopped is because the murderer, Jack the Ripper, or Mr. Masterson, got into that carriage accident and was partially paralyzed. We'll continue the rest of this chapter in the next video.